Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Orange Theater. I thank you all for coming out on this evening. We know it's a warm evening, but I thank you all for taking time out your schedule to come by. My name is Gloria White. I'm with the Heritage Museum of Montgomery County, and I am also the board president. So our guest tonight is Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, and I would like to just give a little brief history about Professor Reed. Annette Gordon-Reed is a Conroe native and a graduate of a Conroe high school. Her picture is on the Wall of Fame in downtown Conroe, 1 block east of here. A bust in her honor is located in Conroe's Founders Plaza, just outside this building. And the Conroe Independent School District Board of Trustees voted to name Gordon-Reed Elementary School in her honor, and the school will be opening up this fall. Professor Gordon-Reed has won 16 book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2009 and the National Book Award in 2008 for The Hemingses of Monticello and American Family. Professor Gordon-Reed was the Vivian Armsworth Visiting Professor of American History at the University of Oxford, Queens College, 2014 through 2015. Between 2010 and 2015, she was the Carol K. Forstheimer Professor at the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study at Harvard University. She was the 2018 through 19 President of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. She is currently the Carl M. Loeb University Professor of History at Harvard University. So let us welcome our guest, Professor Gordon-Reed. Let's give a big round of applause.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank all of you for coming out on this hot day. I was telling somebody I thought this started in July and August. I didn't think this was June weather, but I was rudely awakened to this when I arrived at Houston on Friday and decided to take a walk after breakfast, thinking, oh, I'm downtown, I'll see what the old days, see what it looks like. And by the time I got back to the hotel, I was drenched, straight into the shower. This is unlike anything that's ever happened to me, obviously, to be able to come home and to talk about a book that I never thought I would be writing. You know, this is a departure from me. I write about Virginia and slavery in early America. I know all about the Hemings family. I know all about Jefferson's family, and the Randolph family, and all of the FFVs, as they call them, First Families of Virginia in the Chesapeake area. But writing about Texas isn't something that I thought I would do more than just maybe an article or whatever. And I did an article for the New Yorker a couple of years ago about Juneteenth, but it was more about family, the family story of how we celebrated Juneteenth, with a little bit of Texas history involved. And this was during the beginning of the pandemic. And Harvard had closed. We'd gone to virtual teaching. And I live in New York, and I work at Harvard, which is in Cambridge, meaning that I commute between those two states. I'm in Cambridge 3 days a week and New York the rest of the week. But once the school closed, I decided that it made sense for me to stay in New York with my husband, obviously, and so that's what I did. And we spent most of the day, when my husband wasn't foraging for stuff at the store, when we were able to go out, he's a forager, he likes that kind of thing, and going to Central Park, walking around, and we could see the tents that they had built for the overflow of the people, who couldn't be in the regular hospital rooms because there were so many people. So what I'm getting at is that New York, as you know, was ground zero for this, and it was not a great time. And I began to think about my mother and my father, who are no longer living, and thinking about what they would have made of this moment when the whole world was being held hostage to this virus. And I talked to my editor who said, you know, you should write a book about Texas. And having done the essay about Juneteenth, I came up with the idea of doing a small book about the holiday, but also to talk more broadly about Texas history in general. And I don't usually like to talk about myself, because when I'm a historian, you're writing about other people and other people's family and their problems and their gossip and all of that, and not your own life. But I think I secretly, well, not so secretly to me, had longed to be able to write the kind of essays that I read as a teenager here in the Montgomery County Library. James Baldwin, people like that who, you know, wrote about their experiences. And I thought this was an occasion to do that. So that's why I decided to write a short book. The Hemingses of Monticello is a long book. This is a short book that would talk about my family just enough to talk about Texas history. And that is something that I'd wanted to do in the back of my mind, but thought I would never actually do a book about Texas history. One of the things that happens when you move from Texas and go other places, as I moved to the Northeast, I went to Dartmouth at age 18, Hanover, New Hampshire, completely opposite part of the country. Found out a lot about winter up there. The winter up there is as extreme as the heat is here. It's the same, its counterpart. One of the things that you find yourself doing if you're a Texan in other places is explaining Texas. People, so what's up with that? You know? I mean, Florida and Texas may be the two places where people say, and I have wanted to do that. I thought, you know, maybe I could write a book that would explain some things about Texas. Maybe not everything, but some of the things that seem to puzzle people a lot. And it occurred to me, and it has occurred to me, that people think of Texas in a very narrow way. And I say in the book, to most people, Texas is a white man. The sort of image of Texas, a cowboy, a cattle rancher, you know, that, or the oil man, that defines the country. But what does it mean if you're a woman? Or if you're not white? If you're not of Anglo or descent? And the thing about Texas that I wanted people to understand from the book is that Texas has been a diverse place from the very beginning. It started out with the multiplicity, obviously, of indigenous people, and then the Spanish, and then the English, people of English origin and German origin came, and people of African descent from the beginning. It's not like a state that has become diverse over time. It began that way. So we've always been these different languages, different races, different cultures together. And there are good things about that, but it can also cause conflict. But I don't think people think about that very much. It's a very narrow vision of what Texas is like, and don't get a sense of what the place really means. The other thing is that Texas is not typically seen as being a part of the South. It's the Southwest, it is true. We have a Western tradition, and the connection to Mexico makes us different from other places. But East Texas was a plantation society. My ancestors, and one of the things that I got to look at a little bit in working on this book was, my ancestors on my father's side, were brought from, they didn't come voluntarily, were brought from Georgia, and on my mother's side from Mississippi and Alabama to Texas very early on. From the census begins for African American people really in the 1870s, but you can still get 1870 census. Before then, their slave schedules are not mentioned, but you can, if people have been on Ancestry.com, you know that they ask them where their parents were born. So you can get some sense, you can peer back just a little bit. And my family, begins, as I can see from that, at least on my mother's side, from the 1820s in Texas, before Texas is a republic, and certainly before it's a state, and on my father's side in the 1850s. So we are from here from a very, very long time ago. And unlike other black families, many black families who left the South, who they left, they would say escaped the South, and in the Great Migration and moved north, my family didn't do that in the main. The Gordons and the Calebs remained in Texas. If they left Livingston and Moscow and all those little places, they went to Houston, or they went to San Antonio, or they went to Dallas. They did not go to New Hampshire or New York, or those places. My husband's family is from Arkansas, and their family just pretty much picked up as a whole group and left and went out to California and into Arizona. So I consider myself to be, I'm Texan from a long time ago, and most of the family is still here and have always been here. So I felt that I had the right to talk about the state and to talk about it from my perspective, the things that I felt about the state. And I wanted to make plain to people that it's a difficult place, but it's a place that I really love. And people ask me why, because you mainly hear about the negative things, right? About the state most often, or controversy. But for me, it was where my family was. And my mother, this is how I have a sense of being in a place where I was loved by people who really wanted the best for me. I grew up in not great circumstances. Conroe was a segregated place. When we went to Sadler Clinic, there was a waiting room for black people and one for white people. And the nurse's station could see into either side. And I say in the book, I talk about looking over there and being envious of the magazines that they had on the other side there, even as a little kid. And, to go to Anderson Elementary School under the Freedom of Choice plan, which was a plan that was designed for white parents to pick white schools for their kids and black parents to pick black schools, and my parents deciding to pick a white school. And I ended up at Anderson Elementary School with Mr. Moorhead as the principal and Mrs. Daughtry as my first grade teacher. We all remember our first grade teachers, right? The second mom, maybe kindergarten and first grade teachers or junior, second moms to people. And she was that to me. People ask me what it was like to do that, to go there by myself, because I don't even know if there were any black janitors at Anderson. It was the entire environment was white. But Mrs. Daughtry and Mr. Moorhead and the other teachers there could not have been better. They handled it exactly the right way. And I don't say this in the book, because this is what happens when you write a book. You think of all the stuff you should have put in while you're working on it. I wonder if the fact that my mother was a teacher at Booker T. Washington, which was the black school, K through 12. I wondered if the fact that my mother was a teacher influenced the way they treated me, the teachers there. Now, they were decent people, and I'm sure they would have done it anyway, but I think that might have been an extra part of it. They were dealing with a teacher's child, and they were on my side, and they made that clear that they were on my side. Now, the kids were a mixed bag. Some of them were nice, and some of them were not nice, as you could imagine, from the different circumstances in their homes and the attitudes of their family, because obviously we are the product of all of that. I talk in the book about having people who were friendly to me in school, but if I would see them at Whackers, does anybody remember Whackers? whackers. They wouldn't say hello. And that was an early lesson about the pressure that people feel. You know when somebody really likes you. I think these people, some of these kids actually genuinely like me, but they like their parents too, right? And their family. And a choice between loyalty to me and our friendship at Anderson and the people that they're living with, there's no contest. There's just no contest. And my father used to say this. He said, you know, your friends, and he meant your white friends, can know the right thing to do and want to do the right thing to do, but their family will not let them. And they will let them, you know, either through guilt or the possibility of being ostracized. And nobody wants to be cut off from their family. Certainly not little kids. Many times when people get to be adults, they change their views. They move a bit away from what their parents, it may not go too far, but they can change. But little kids are going to, for the most part, toe the line because they love their family, and that's understandable. So it made me think about that. I had the occasion, in other words, to think about things that I would not have if I had just been at Booker T. Washington, if I had not gone through this process. And I knew it was something that was important because of the way the adults around me were talking about it, the situation. I had an aunt, my mother's aunt, who lived in Houston, and she liked to shop. And I had clothes, but when I was going to go to Anderson, she went to Sakowitz and bought an exorbitant amount of things. I very rarely had to change outfits. She just went overboard to make sure that I was going to be dressed, to go to do this thing. And so from that, I got the sense that I don't remember any specific conversations about it, but I knew what Conroe was like because of the movies. We went to the Crichton and we sat in the balcony, and as I mentioned, Sadler Clinic. So I knew going to school, and I had been at Washington School as a kindergartner, and Mrs. Kelo was my kindergarten teacher. And so I knew we were supposed to be separated, and I knew I was going to this school. And I also listened to, my parents were big watchers of the news, and I knew that stuff was going on in the world. There was a movement. This is in the mid-'60s, the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. People were marching. There was a sense of progress. And I've often thought over the years about my two children, and would I have done what my parents did in the circumstances that they were in here in Conroe, or anywhere, as a matter of fact. And my kids went to a school that was predominantly white, but there were black people there. There were teachers. It was different than this. And I would probably say no, that I wouldn't. And I wonder what's the difference. And I think about it, and as a historian, I have to keep in mind that when you're writing about a particular era or people in a particular era, you have to think of the context in which they are operating. And my parents were in a very different context than I was in when my kids were little in the 90s. Nothing was really going on in the 90s. Grunge, maybe, Kurt Cobain or whatever. There was no movement. My parents, I think they were idealistic and didn't think that they were alone making this decision because other people were doing other things. There was a movement in the country, the marching that I talked about, the laws. And so maybe I would have if I had been in that moment. So they were in a particular moment, and I was brought into that moment. And I think the experience of doing that here in Conroe really shaped me and probably started me on the road to becoming a historian. Certainly pointed me towards law, because I understood in law school, because I understood that what had happened to me was a product of law. There was a law that kept blacks and whites apart in Conroe and other places in the South. There were laws that challenged that. And so law was an instrument of social change. And I think I had that experience. I was exposed to that idea very early on, and I wouldn't have been without that particular moment. So when I think about being from a particular place and how it shaped me, I have to think about that, to think about those early influences. And I remember coming to downtown Conroe when there was a downtown Conroe. That there is a downtown Conroe. I understand it is being revitalized, that we're moving towards that. And I do remember sort of the tension, feeling tension in going into stores. I remember one time being in a clothing store, and I touched the dress in a particular way, and the owner sharply rebuked me for that. You know how you have to pull the dress out. I wasn't buying a dress, they were grown-up dresses, but I wanted to see it. And I pulled it out, and he spoke really harshly, and I remember my mother grabbing my hand and walking out because she thought, that was too much, that it was not, he wouldn't have responded that way if I had been white. And I think that was her thought about it. And, I think about those days, and I think about my mother and my father, and realizing that they were basically me without the kind of opportunities that I had. My mother went to Spelman College. She did go off to college. My father went to the Army to help support his younger sisters. His father was an invalid, and his mother had died when he was 11. But they didn't, even with my mother going to Spelman and coming back to TSU for grad school, they didn't have the kind of opportunities that we've had and that I've had. So I try to conjure up their lives over in Dugan on South 4th Street, living next to Ms. Reese, who was here, my mother's oldest friend, dearest friend. What would it be like to be in those circumstances and to have dreams for yourself that are hard, or it would be really, really hard for them to fulfill in a segregated society? And so I think I was going to be a mechanism for helping to change all of that. And as I've said, I've been very, very much aware of that. So I start the book talking about me. Even though this is a book about Texas, I'm trying to tell Texas history, a part of Texas history, through my story. It is linked to Juneteenth because I know that the things that happened to me as I was growing up here, the society that was created, was a society that is a legacy of the institution of slavery. I mentioned before, people don't think of Texas as being a part of the South, as a plantation economy. You think of Georgia, Tara, or Mississippi. But they grew cotton here too. And my great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents picked cotton here and sugar cane. Texas was started, the Texas that we know really got going with the father of Texas, Stephen F. Austin, as we all know from our 4th grade and 7th grade Texas history class, and maybe an elective in high school, when he brings over people who bring slaves with them. It was found that these people wanted to be a part of the Cotton Empire, wanted to extend the Cotton Empire. And he writes a letter in which he says that if whites come to Texas without slaves, they could expect to be poor for a very long time because they needed people to fell the trees, plant, and harvest crops. And he portrayed himself, he saw himself as being anti-slavery, not so much because of the moral question, but he had a problem with the idea of large numbers of black people in this new area. So he was discomfited by the racial differences that existed and wondered if they could coexist. So this is not something that I think I was taught about very much in the 4th grade, or it was mentioned during that time period. We talked a little bit about slavery, but I didn't know until I was a teenager about Mexico and Mexico's attitude towards slavery, which was to abolish it essentially and give the Texians an exemption, which they never trusted, which was part of the reason they wanted a republic. It wasn't the only reason. I mean, he did suspend the Constitution. There were cultural differences, religious differences, but slavery was a part of it. I mean, I'm fascinated by the controversy here now about teaching history in Texas. You know, this idea that you can't talk about things that make people uncomfortable. Well, you know, life is not all about comfort. I mean, it's the good and the bad. You have to have both of those things to understand the whole story. And I don't see how you're going to teach about the Republic of Texas if you don't read the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, which explicitly condones slavery and says that African American people can't come to Texas without permission, they can't become citizens. It's a very clear attempt to create, as I said, to make it a part of the Cotton Empire. Now, that doesn't mean that little kids today who are reading this are responsible for that. Not at all. But what it means is that you have to know how we got here, how we have some of the problems that we have, the strengths and the weaknesses comes from talking about the entire story. And I would say, Mr. Topple was my history professor. We didn't do Texas history, but made us keep up with current events and think about the world as it was at the time, to sort of pay attention to who we were as a society. And you can't do that if you don't have the whole story. So I really hope you get this settled. I hope in some fashion, because it's just not gonna work. How do you celebrate Juneteenth without talking about the fact that there were people who were enslaved? And that's not a happy story. And history is not just about happy stories or just about the people who we like and are our best friends or whatever. It's about the story of what really happened. And so I talk in the book about the Republic of Texas, the Alamo, going to see the movie, The Alamo, as it was reissued in 1968, 1969 with Gary Reese, Mrs. Reese's son. And I talk about, the sense that we had that these were 100% heroes, and not knowing the other part of this story, that William Barrett Travis was not such a great guy in other ways. He left his wife and children in Alabama to come out to sort of seek his fortune. They did brave things at the Alamo. I mean, anytime you're willing to die for something, but you have to think about what it was they were dying for. That has to be a part of the story. It can be an inspiration for people, if you need that kind of thing, but you also have to tell the true history of it. And I understand that there's a controversy about that in San Antonio, how it's going to be presented. So I talk a little bit about that in the book and what it's like to come to terms with this very complicated story about the Alamo as a Texan, when you were raised to think just about the good side, just about the bravery, but not about the underlying society that they were trying to create. I talk about indigenous people. I talk about a movie, Billy Jack, seeing at North Hill Cinema, Billy Jack a couple of times with people, everybody cheering Billy Jack on, the half Indian, half white protagonist, and being for him as he sort of defended the hippie school. And it was kind of a cognitive dissonance for me, because I kind of figured that many people in the audience would not have liked those hippies so much if they were actually living in Conroe. But on the movie, in the dark, it was so clear who was right and who was wrong there. And I think people felt the freedom to cheer on these countercultural people that I really wondered how they would have taken in real life. But, the 70s, if you remember it, people of my generation, Indian stuff was big, and everybody had the headbands, and people parted their hair down the middle, and wore headbands and fringe vests. I had a fringe vest, all that kind of stuff. And recalling this time here in Conroe, experiencing that moment when Native peoples were romanticized, even as they were sort of erased, except being born in Livingston. I was born about 17 miles away from the Alabama Coshada Indian Reservation, which we started to go to in the 1970s. So I have a chapter in which I talk about the mixing of the cultures here. And the disappearing of Native Americans the chapter is The People of the Past and the People of the Present, because when I was a kid, Indians were portrayed as people who were gone. They used to be here, but they're not here anymore. But they're here, and they never left. They were always here. And what it means to bring them back into the Texas story. And I end the book with an essay on Juneteenth, bringing all of this together, because the book is not just about the holiday. And on Juneteenth really means how the holiday, how it fits within the scope of Texas history. That there was slavery, and then slavery ended, and then there was a struggle after slavery. And I talk about Galveston, which has figured in my family history in a way that I hadn't thought very much about. One of the things I could kick myself about as a historian is that my great-grandmother was alive until I was about 11 years old. And she used to tell me stories, and I wouldn't listen. Because you're a kid, you're self-absorbed, you have your own things, and I would give anything to be able, to ask questions. What was it like to be in Moscow, Texas at the end of the 19th century? To be born there, to grow up in this place. What was it like for Black people? I know the statistics, I know the big things, but day-to-day existence. How did you deal? What was this like? But of course I didn't listen. And I did remember a story about my great-grandfather who, they had a farm in Moscow, and he would go to the docks in Galveston to work and make extra money, when he didn't have to be on the farm. And from that, I did a little bit of research. Couldn't do very much archival research because, as I said, I was stuck in my apartment in New York. But there are many things online, and I discovered that Galveston, I had never thought about this, that Galveston before Houston was the city. It was the important, because it was the port. And there were lots of Black people there, and there were Black men who worked on the docks. They had a union at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. I don't know if I want to go back and look at this now. I don't know if my great-grandfather was a part of this, but working on the docks was a thing for Black men at that time. And I really want to investigate this more. It was a city where, as I said, the large Black population who were seen as, a word they would use would be uppity. Jack Johnson was from Galveston, the boxer, the flamboyant boxer was from Galveston. And so that was the kind of attitude that people had. And this is where Granger comes in June of 1865 and makes the announcement that slavery is over in Texas. Now, when we were growing up, there was a kind of semi-joke about that, the fact that this is 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed in 1863, and Lee had surrendered in April, before June. And they said, well, why weren't the black people in Texas didn't know that they were free? And that's not true. That's a bad joke. And some people said, well, they wanted to get another harvest in, so they didn't tell Black people. Well, Black people knew about the Emancipation Proclamation. They worked in the homes of whites. They knew what white people knew. They paid attention to this stuff. People carried word of this. The issue was the Army of the Trans-Mississippi kept fighting. Lee surrendered, but they kept fighting. And in fact, the last battle of the Civil War was in Texas, and Confederates won, but they lost the war, and they surrender at the beginning of June. And that's how Granger gets to come to Galveston and make this announcement. And there are reports of black men on the docks celebrating before he gets there. And people asked him why, and he said, well, because we're going to be free. So they knew they knew what he was going to say before he got there, but they also understood that this was a long process. Emancipation didn't become legal. Slavery doesn't end legally until December 1865, when the 13th Amendment is ratified. But Juneteenth is significant because it marks the end of the armed conflict to support the institution of slavery. That's when the Army gives up, and then Granger is able to make this announcement. And he says something in General Order Number 3 that I think is really important. He could have just said, and now slavery's over, that's it. But he says that the former slaves would occupy a position of absolute equality with other people in society. Now we know that didn't happen, and we know we're still fighting for that. But the fact that he said it, I think, is really important, because that word equality, why would he do that? Why would he say that, think it was necessary? And I think he is hearkening back to the American Declaration of Independence, which is seen as America's creed, which puts equality at the heart of American values. That's important. And he really anticipates the 14th Amendment, which does reference, which is sort of in the wake of the Declaration as well, the Equal Protection Clause. Equality is an important value. And he says this, and I think about what the people who heard this must have felt, the enslaved people, former enslaved people. I do know that many white people were upset about that, not only the loss of property, but the idea that people whom they had treated as chattel would now be their equals, and they were not happy. I found instances of people who were whipped for celebrating, dozens of people at a time for celebrating. And nevertheless, they kept celebrating. African American people in Texas, Black Texans have celebrated Juneteenth for 156 years, 157 years, beginning in churches at first. It was called Emancipation Day. It becomes Juneteenth, I don't know the precise moment, but it's a mashup, obviously, of June 19th. And Emancipation Day becomes Juneteenth, and they keep celebrating. One of the most poignant stories for me was the story of 5 black men in Houston former enslaved people, who pool their resources and buy land for the express purpose of celebrating Juneteenth. And that land became Emancipation Park, which still exists. And to think of this, these are people who were treated as property, and they're thinking about the future. They're imagining me and other African American descendants who will remember this day, and confident that they would remember this day and carry it forward. And that meant a lot to me, to think that it is still there. People have gone there, sort of waxed and waned. I think it's becoming, there now that the holiday has become a federal holiday. I think it will be even more important. But that kind of faith in the middle of really tough circumstances, and I think we think sometimes we have it hard. In some ways we do, but nothing like that. And people ask, well, why do you celebrate this? Why do this, commemorate this? And it's because these people went forward with such hope. And if they had not done that, I wouldn't be standing here. And it's that kind of faith that propelled them, and I think we owe it to them to keep this going. So I talk in this last chapter about this moment and what happened afterwards. People knew that it was going to be a struggle, that they would not have it easy, because they had lived in slavery under the lash for long, but they were hopeful. And I think that carrying that forward is a way of honoring them in a way that they should be honored. I had the great fortune to be able to go to the White House when they signed the bill. I was sitting in my bedroom, I was typing along, and I got an email from the White House asking me if I could come down to the signing that afternoon. See, the president had been overseas, and I knew that the person in the Senate the person had given up his opposition, and I knew it was going to be signed, but I didn't know it was going to be signed so quickly. And so this is about 8:30 and 9 o'clock. So then I'm on the 11 o'clock shuttle. I immediately got up, got dressed, went to LaGuardia, bought a ticket, and went down. And in the East Room there with Miss Opal Lee, who I'm sure many of you may have heard of. She's considered the godmother of Juneteenth. She has been campaigning for this for years and years. And she was there, and it was wonderful. It was Cornyn was there, and Texans, people who don't, Sheila Jackson Lee, people who probably don't agree on very much, Cornyn and Lee, but they did agree on that. And they got together on that point. I mean, I have to say this, and this is a little bit of an aside. When I won the Pulitzer Prize, I heard from both the senators from Texas. I got congratulations, Kay Baylor Hutchins, I think it was, and I got something Cornyn. I'm not a Republican, but I'm a Texan, and they read about this in the news in their offices. I mean, so Texans have a way of, if something's going to shine a light on Texans, they kind of like it. So they were there together. And it was a wonderful ceremony. Now, the question is, what are we going to do next? Is it going to be, as I've said, just an occasion for a mattress sale, or what are they going to do? Used cars, like old Abe or whatever. We don't want it to come to that, although we know inevitably it will, because this is the United States of America and we sell things. That's part of our life. But I think the fact that we've had 156 years of celebrating this will give a template for other people. This is a holiday that is perfect for history. It is perfect for family. Whether you're white or you're black, it was an advance in human rights. It didn't solve all problems, but it was a step in the right direction. And I think we can all celebrate that. You don't have to, you don't have to be the descendant of enslaved people to appreciate advances in human rights. We all should appreciate that. And I'm hoping that we will stave off the commercialism for a time, even though I know it will be here, and do this. One of the things I've suggested that I hope that people do, unlike me when I was a kid, would be on this day maybe to have young people and families take the family history of older people, talk to older people in the family, write things down. I mean, oral history is important, and I've used oral history, corroborated oral history in my work, but it works so much better if people put things down. And we can do that now. iPhones, whatever, talk to your grandparents. I mean, we're not in an institution of slavery, but the pandemic, 100 years from now, 80 years from now, people are going to be interested in what was it like. We still don't know yet. I think we haven't come to grips with what has happened to us, I think, these past 2 years. I mean, some people more than others, but do that. Make that a part of a tradition, and everybody can do that. And it's a commemorating people whose stories could not be told because they weren't allowed to tell their stories and to keep them. So that's what I hope will happen with this book. I've been, I think flabbergasted by the response to it. It's done very well in sales and gotten some very nice notices. And it started from, as I said, my desire to commune with my parents, my family, to think about my life here with them. It wasn't always an easy life. This could be a difficult place, but it's where I learned to love people and where people loved me. And that's what's important in the end. And that's why I still consider this to be my community. So with that, I would like to take questions you may have.
Recently that Harvard has decided to come to grips with its racist past. Were you a part of that, and how has that affected you?
Well, I was on the committee to look at Harvard's ties to slavery, And we spent a couple of years doing that. The pandemic interrupted us. Well, I learned a lot about Harvard. I learned a lot about Harvard's connections to the Caribbean. One of the big things in history now, in American history, is the realization that we've always been a global, slavery was a global institution. And to learn about how closely New England was tied to slavery in the West Indies was a real revelation for me. I mean, I knew it, but it's not until, when you put names to things, it matters. You know, to talk about things in terms of statistics, that's one. But if you see the names, you know, how many people from families in the West Indies came to Harvard, paid their tuition in sugar, you know, because it was such a valuable commodity and so forth. It opened my eyes a lot about the trade, more than just, you know, I have focused mainly on plantation society, but not as much the trade, and so that was an eye-opener for me.
Were you the only black child in your elementary school?
For the first year, yes. Then I was joined after, you know. And then even before the court changed their rulings, Pam Hunter came to Anderson. So we were there together, the following year.
I have read in several places that there were many more black slaves in South America than there were in North America. Do you have any theory as to what happened to that, why there was no Civil War there, or what happened to those slaves?
Well, she's talking about more enslaved people in Brazil. Brazil's a little closer. It's easier to get to transport, and they did. Most of the enslaved people, they estimate between 800,000 and about 1,000,001 came to the United States. The rest all went to Brazil and West Indies, and they're still there. I mean, it's in America, the 900,000 or million became 4 million by the time of the Civil War. But there are many, many more black people in Brazil and in South America. Why didn't they don't emancipate people until the end of the 19th century. There are more recorded slave revolts and so forth. It's just a different society. And as a result, many of the enslaved people in Brazil, they're much closer to African culture. They retained much more of it because they're growing sugar cane. Sugar cane is a killer for women and fertility and so forth and childbirth. And so they died faster, and so they kept bringing people over. In the United States, the principal crop at first was tobacco, which, well, none of this is easy, right? But tobacco, rice, indigo, much less harsh than sugarcane production. So the West Indies and Brazil were about sugarcane, about sugar. That was their big deal. And people were just dying. And so it was cheaper to let these people die and bring over new people. And what ends up happening in America is that enslaved people began to replace themselves and began to have as many children as white people had. So they didn't have to keep bringing people over because the increase was natural. And it has a lot to do, as I said, with the crop, with what it is that they were growing.
Will there be a book on the findings of the Harvard Committee?
We did a long report that's almost like a book. There might be. But the full report is online, and it's pretty extensive. And yeah, it was a worthwhile effort. And I think there are people who were, well, some people say, forget about that. That happened in the past, but obviously that's not the way to go.
What are some ways your first grade teacher and the principal helped you and what are some ways that we can do better?
What are, people didn't hear her. She said, what are some of the ways that that my first grade teacher and principal helped me? They were just nice. They treated me like a human being. I mean, you know, when kids can sense when people are being condescending to them. You know, if they don't, if they're smiling, but they're not, their eyes aren't really smiling. And they just were natural, normal, I mean, just like human interactions with people. I didn't sense any artifice, any fake stuff. It was all just, you know, you're a kid, and you have to toe the line, and if I didn't, do as well as they thought I could do, they would say, no, you can do better than that. They just treated me like a person. And I should say it's easy, but apparently it's not for some people, but it should be easy. And that's really what it was. It's the sense of treating you seriously as a human being. And they both did that. Mrs. Gilliland was my second grade teacher, and she was the same. Just fantastic people.
Was that your experience as you went into junior high, high school? Was that acceptance and that kindness there all along?
Not all the way. No. Maybe elementary school teachers are different. No, I mean, you probably know what you're I mean, you understand the importance of your role. Not to say that high school teachers, Mr. Topple was wonderful. Not to say that high school teachers don't, but but I did, and you have more teachers. Once you get to high school, you have a bunch of, somebody for English, somebody for math. It's all separated out. I had some not so great, nice people. But I'm sure you could all tell that story as well. Not even just about race. It's just that there were some people who are nicer than other people.
One of the things that you talked about, and I hear it again and again and again from authors, is imagination.
Mm-hmm.
That this was something your parents had for you,
Mm-hmm.
the imagination of you being more, having more, the hope to become something better. That comes to me from inside, but also from books that you obviously have taken that up as a craft. And why is it that people don't continue to read? I am probably a book hoarder with over 40,000 of them in my house, which is
Whoa.
yeah, my children will probably just, light a fire on my house and send me off like a Viking.
Out the slow boat.
Right, so that's right. Better than cleaning it up. But what can we do? It is a passion I have felt my whole life. How do we transfer that to make people more curious, to seek the learning, the facts beyond what it is that takes away the fear that we're dealing with right now in our schools and libraries about books for the love of people?
Yeah. Well, it's tough. Because I don't want to say you either have it or you don't, but I almost kind of want to say that. Different people like different things. I mean, for me, books were a way to see the world. And I loved weekly readers and, bringing your money for the weekly reader and going to the library. And I was always at the library, the city library here, town library on Saturdays. That's where I went. And my mother, once I got my license, she'd say, well, if you're bored, you could go up to Sam, to go up to Sam Houston, because you could go to that library. And I did that a lot. It's just, books have just been a passion for me. Not, as you said, not everybody has that. And it could be that this generation of people, the younger generation of people with the screen and other things, they have different interests and maybe different, I don't want to say talents, different ways of getting information. But for me, the feel of a book, I buy books online, but I never finish them. I start reading them and it's just, I prefer the book itself. So I think you just you just teach them young and hope that later on you'll light a spark in some people and it will continue. I have a lot of friends, but it's because I am a professor, and so I guess we're all sort of a self-selected cohort. But most of my friends read a lot, and they're reading quite a bit, and so I think you just have to introduce people to it as young people and hope that it continues.
I have a question. When you say the people you interact with in elementary schoolmates, when they see you today, do they have the same recollection that you have as you guys have?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen any of my people that I knew from elementary school.
You didn't have the same group that went through, because of Conroe, I'm thinking y'all had the same group that kind of moved together.
Well, we moved together, but I went to Conroe High School. We had 4,000 people in the high school. So, yeah, we were all spread out by that time period. I still keep in contact with Facebook. This is the great thing about Facebook. I mean, I know people knock Facebook, and there are lots of reasons for doing it, but I've been in touch with my old debate partners, Marcella, all these people that I know who are Labessa. We're on Facebook friends, and we would never have made that kind of contact again without it. So I'm more in touch with older people, not the elementary. That's a good question. I would like to talk to people who I knew at that time to see what they thought what was going on from their perspective.
I'm wondering if the history stayed the same. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because, I have some of the same issues. Not issues so much as memories.
Yeah.
And I think our memories may not be right. It gets turned around.
Oh, absolutely.
I think history is so important. Actual history. Not paisley colored history. Actual, how it is.
No, I mean, and that's the task as a historian, is to try to figure out, what is the story, because they're differing. And when I was working on the book about Jefferson and Hemings, there was one group of people who saw things this way, and another group of people saw it that way. What can I look at that tells me which one of these people is more likely telling the truth, or as close to truth as possible? So that's a good question. I really would like to talk to some of the people that I was in elementary school with and say, do you remember when this happened, or do you remember what was going on? Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to reading your book, and it's wonderful to see you. I would suggest that one of the problems is that we get the idea that slavery has ended. Slavery has not ended. It has changed its face. There was Slavery by Another Name, that wonderful book about what happened.
Oshinsky, yeah.
And now our U.S. penal system is another form of slavery, disproportionate imprisonment of black men. That still goes on in America today, that we white people are very often blind to. And so I would only make a comment that Juneteenth is a wonderful thing, but it's false to think that slavery has ended in white America today.
Well, I understand your point, and I think I put that definitely, what some of the things that are happening today with police and mass incarceration, all of those things, it's a legacy of slavery. What Juneteenth is about, the one thing I would push back on a little bit is that the knowledge that a person could not legally go into your home and take your children and sell them, and you never see them again. That was the trauma of slavery, and all the things that people talk about. The whipping is bad, being made to work, rape. Those things were terrible. But the loss of family was a constant trauma. If you go through, and I can't prove this, but I'm convinced this is right. If you go through airports in the summer, you'll see groups of black people with Garris t-shirts on with the Reed family reunion, the this family reunion, the that family reunion. This notion of gathering up family, and even Juneteenth as a community and a family holiday about bringing people together, I think is a direct result of the separation of families. After the war was over, people used to put ads in newspaper looking for friends, looking for family. Have you seen my mother? I last saw her. And so, I mean, mass incarceration is terrible. And it is a legacy of slavery and white supremacy. I believe that those are connected here. But this particular thing is about the treatment of a status, or giving people a status. Through your mother, black women were made the vehicles for the institution of slavery because you were what your mother was. When they came to America, English came with the tradition that you were what your father was. But they switched it to you are what your mother was. And so you can see how that works better in slavery. So I think it's a form of slavery. It's something, it's akin to it, but being treated like property and carrying that over to your children and your children's children and your children's children's children, to be staring down the barrel of that must have been just awful, a psychological torture for people. And we have to work on this issue of mass incarceration and police. And as I said, it's a legacy of slavery. But I don't want us to forget what it means to be treated as an item of property, of actual property, with all the accoutrements of property, inheritance, devise, gift, all those kinds of contracts, renting, all of those things. And so that's what I think Juneteenth is about. It's a way of focusing. We can focus on these other things as well, but not lose sight of that.
Two things. As an educator, one thing that has proved true to me over the years, and with students like you, every child that they came in contact with, I firmly believe that children, students, either live up or live down to your expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you must have had those who recognized in you, justifiably so, and had high expectations for you. And as you said, if they saw you perhaps not doing, that's what as an educator I always, come on, you
Mm-hmm.
can do,
Yeah, yeah.
you can do, that's there in you, just show it.
Yeah.
Second thing is, what class did you graduate with at Conroe High?
I graduated second question first. I graduated in 1977. Yep. Classmates over here. And expectations. I should say, yes, the teachers had high expectations of me. And I have to say this before. I mean, my mother and my father, but particularly my mother, thought I could do anything. And, you know, she thought I could do anything. And sometimes it was like, Ma, I can't. But she had complete faith in me. And that means a lot. My father, too. But my mother really, to have somebody to go out into the world with someone with that kind of faith in you has meant everything. And everything I do, I think about her. And it's just amazing. I am so... I so wish she could be here to have seen all of the things that she put in motion. And I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.